whole concept of a world federation as a world movement, you probably know, came out of the First World War, the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom. During the First World War, they said, now what is the real cause of these wars? You know, what I mean, the whole world is slaughtering each other, and they realized that this idea of sovereign nations, or militarized sovereign nations, having no law above themselves, was fundamental to what was happening in the First World War. And of course, intellectually, the idea goes way back to the ancient Greek Stoics and so on, but it became a movement then, and it was pretty strong between the wars as a world government movement, and then again after the Second World War. Albert Camus wrote Neither Victims Nor Executioners, and in that he says we need a world parliament. He says, you know, this system of victims and executioners is absurd. We need world authority. And then there was a big conference in Montreux, Switzerland, called the Montreux Conference, 1950. And I think 500 people were there. I mean, it was really a lot of World Federalists. That was probably the high point of World Federalism. But the Montreux Conference didn't result in unity. There was like three directions that they went in. One group said the UN Charter, when the UN had just been started 5 years earlier, the UN Charter has great potential, but it's inadequate. It's not a government, and we need to work on reforming the UN. So they went to reform it. Here we are all this time later, and it has not been reformed yet, right? And they have failed substantially. Another group said we need to start with regional unions, and they started working on the European Union, and they were quite successful, you know. And then the third group said, no, what we really need is a constitution for the earth, and some of the people that eventually became WCPA were in that third group. One of the people who had been in prison during the Second World War because he refused to, he said this is a war of sovereign militarized nations. It's not good versus evil, and he refused to go in, so he was in prison. It was Philip Isley, and so he and others became organized through the world government offices that were already there in the United States. But in 1958, they announced a new organization called the World Constitutional Parliament Association, and their goal was to write a constitution. They said, this is what the world needs. It hasn't been done yet. And so he used his considerable money he had. He and his wife organized people around the world, and they had 4 constituent assemblies. One in 1968, the first one, in Interlaken, Switzerland. And then out of that, the couple hundred people that came together there they elected a drafting committee of 25 persons and issued a series of things that needed to be included in the Constitution. So that drafting committee worked on it. They came out with a draft in 1972 and circulated it worldwide and for comments and so on. And then in 1977 they had what's now called the Second Constituent Assembly. That was in Innsbruck, Austria. And people came together and they had a draft of the Constitution. They went over it paragraph by paragraph, and people they were in tears at the end of that. I wasn't there. I didn't know about this movement at that time, but they said we have done something incredible for the world. Sent out copies of this to all the heads of nations, all the ambassadors in the United Nations, and they did not get any positive response. Right? And so they met again with what we call the Third Constituent Assembly in Colombo, Sri Lanka, 1979, and discussed the issue and so on, and they came out with a statement there about the rights of people to ratify this Earth Constitution, regardless of whether the nations cooperated. And in Article 17 of the Constitution, there's that option. People can vote directly and elect the World Parliament and so on, and get the thing going, and even if the nations are not cooperative. And in 1991, there had been, between 79 and 91, there was some additional criticisms from the group that had written that about wording, small things about wording and so on. And so in 1991, they met in Troia, Portugal, and we call that the fourth and last Constituent Assembly. And in Troia, Portugal, they made some changes, and they decided, okay, it's a finished document. It's ready for the people of Earth to ratify. And I think that was a wise decision, because if it's just a suggestion, a draft, and we're offering it to you, there'll be endless debates about wording, about this idea and that idea. And the world, in our view, the world is in such a mess, and they even understood it back in 1991, right? The world is so threatened with even possible extinction of human beings, with nuclear war or whatever, that we really don't have time to debate this little sentence or that sentence. The Constitution makes ample provision for amendments. In fact, it's an evolving document. It built right into it. In Article 18 is the requirement that once it gets started, they have to hold another Constituent Assembly within 10 years, and every 20 years after that. And in addition to that, there's facilities for making amendments in between. So it's an evolving, growing document. It's not locked in stone. And so in 1995, I'm a philosopher, and I had been writing about peace issues for years, but I had never been satisfied with all the things that I've been thinking about. How are we going to deal with this human situation that we're in? And when I discovered this in '95, it came as a kind of a revelation to me. Yes, this is what we need to do as human beings: join together and deal with all these global problems in a real, effective way. So I worked with them. Soon I was on the executive council and so on, and we were traveling around promoting the Constitution, holding sessions of the Parliament against odds, because there are forces, or have been forces behind the scenes preventing us from being successful. I could give you one example. There are others, but in 2001, we contacted the government of Malta, and they offered to hold a session of the Provisional World Parliament. Under the Constitution, we are holding sessions of the Provisional World Parliament. Under Article 19, one of the great things about this Constitution is, in Article 17, it gives the steps for ratification. But in Article 19, it recognizes that we, the people of Earth, have the right and the duty to start it now. I mean, what are we waiting for? It's the world is such a mess. And so the fifth session of the Provisional World Parliament was scheduled for Malta, and the government of Malta warmly embraced us, and we reserved big hotels there. And at that time, the Secretary General and his wife had a lot of money, and we had and with that money you can organize big time, right? And so they had 400 to 500 people who wanted to come as delegates to Malta and participate in the fifth session of the Provisional World Parliament. The headquarters was in Denver, Colorado at that time, and we sent two of our employees from Denver 6 weeks ahead of time to work with the government of Malta in processing all these visa applications. Most of the people were from Africa and such places, and they needed visas to come to Malta. So they're working, and the government assigned someone to cooperate with us, and so they're working with us, and all the applications are coming in. The information, there's things that are required, everything is, and they're laying it out, and the government is not approving these. It's said to our people there, we'll approve it all at once, but let's get it all organized first. So it gets to be 3 weeks before, 2 weeks before, 1 week before, and we're saying, okay, it's time, approve these. 2 days before it was scheduled to start, the government of Malta denied them all. Denied them all. And so when it happened, there were about 35 people who didn't need visas, like I didn't need one, and people from Europe didn't need one. So there were about 35 people who showed up there. And the big hotels that we had reserved were outraged. They said, you told us there would be hundreds of people, and they had reserved space for them. So, and this is one example. Now, the government of Malta obviously was setting a trap for us, right, and betrayed us. But behind that, we don't think Malta cares one way or the other. We think the United States is behind much of this. When the U.S. Embassy finds out about what we're doing, they tell these little governments, we're not going to. So anyway, Philip Isley is now deceased, and his family is not interested. So I became Secretary General in 2003 at a meeting in Bangkok, Thailand, and then when the then President passed away, Terence Singh, in 2008 I became President. And I told them, I don't have a lot of money. I'm only a professor, right? And they said, nevertheless, you write about this all the time and so on. And so since 2003, we've had money problems, but we've been growing, and in the last couple of years, quite rapidly, because people are getting worried. They're aware of climate collapse now, and so on, and they're seeing this as a kind of escape route from a world that is locked into. Poor countries are locked into their poverty. Rich countries are locked into their aggression and their imperialism, and it doesn't look like there's any way out of this mess. And the Earth Constitution offers a totally new way out, a new vision.